Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Historian Don Bradley made some waves when he said that Masonic implements were found with the golden plates. It turns out that historian Clair Barrus has some similar beliefs, and we'll talk about some of these early Masonic legends. Check out our conversation. Before we get to that, I just wanted to mention one more thing. As you know, Gospel Tangents has teamed up with the Dialogue Podcast Network. We can now be heard on lyceum.fm, that's lyceum.fm, so you can hear all your favorite podcasts, such as the Dialogue Podcast Network, Gospel Tangents, Beyond the Block, and Mormon News Report. So if you want to hear all of us, and we release every few days, so you'll get a lot of updates. So go to lyceum.fm and subscribe there. Now back to our conversation.
There's some interesting parallels with Joseph Smith here. So Joseph Smith is a treasure seeker in the 1820s, and he's searching for, sometimes they're golden watches, and sometimes they're golden candlesticks and furniture and different things like that. Not too exciting, but it'd be great to score some gold, whatever, I guess. But that's what he's searching for. But all of a sudden, his emphasis shifts. And suddenly, he is looking for long-lost buried scripture written by prophets, and then he translates them while wearing a breastplate and produces it. Now something, okay, so let's talk a bit about the translating device.
So as we go there, so you're really kind of blowing my mind a little bit here, because it sounds like with this breastplate and the stone lid and all this, that sounds very Masonic, right?
Well, yeah, and this is my point.
So this whole anti-Masonic, but yet he's...
Well, okay, the anti-Masonry comes a little later. So between 1823 and 1827, around 1823, Joseph's emphasis shifts from searching for common buried treasure to restoring lost scripture on gold plates, right? There's a huge shift. Now, remember I've done some kind of statistical analysis of how many Masons, the percentage of Masons there were in the population, and I think is between 1 in 13 and 1 in 20 men were Masons, and I've identified.
So 5% would be 1 in 20.
Yeah, and it could be as like 1 in 13, so it could be whatever stat that is, which is quite a few Masons. There were a lot of Masons.
So 1 in 12 would be 8.5%. So we'll go with that. So we'll say 9% to...
Sure.
So 5 to 9% is what we're saying.
Okay, yeah. So, it's quite a few. There's a lot of Masons all over the place. Joseph Smith's brother is a master Mason, Hiram. His father might have been a Mason. There's evidence that suggests he was, but it's not conclusive. Most interestingly, Joseph Smith's, the Chases, remember Sally Chase, and Joseph Smith borrows her green seer stone.
Oh, okay.
And then he finds his own seer stone. Okay, they're the neighbors. And then William, another Chase. Willard Chase, thank you. They do some treasure seeking. The Smiths do some treasure seeking with him. I think he denies that later, but others say he was a treasure seeker. I think he wanted to distance himself from that. But they did some treasure seeking. And then there's I think it was Durfee Chase, who's the older brother. He was a master Mason. He was the head of the lodge, the Master Masonic Lodge, for 2 years. In their records, he's the only one that headed the lodge that he's listed 2 times as the head. And then he becomes a Royal Arch Mason, and then he gets kicked out in 1825, I want to say, but don't quote me on that. At the same time, in 1825, he's also helped the Smiths get in a financial trouble. He helps him out. He's like, hey, let me help you out. So there's a relationship here. He is a Royal Arch Mason, and he's heavy into Masonry, close neighbor. They're treasure seeking together. One historian actually postulates that the reason he was kicked out of the Royal Arch Masonic Lodge is because he was involved in treasure seeking, and they kind of frowned on that. But I don't think this historian has any solid evidence. I think it's just conjecture on his part. Anyway, there's masonry in the air, and then so there's a lot of Masons, the neighbor, and then in 1826 the William Morgan affair. Then that suddenly kicks off publishing Masonic exposés, and so you suddenly have these exposés popping up all over the place. And in fact, like I said, the first anti-Masonic convention was in Seneca, not far from the Smiths where the Whitmers lived. And then, I can't remember the name, but there's a town that's a dozen or so, a few dozen miles from the Smiths, where they have this major anti-Masonic convention, and they decide they say we're going to publish everything we can find about Masons. And a guy named Bernard publishes what's called Light on Masonry, and I think that comes out in 1828. This info is the info is out there. It's widely available. It's not secret. Oh, and there were other Masonic books published, and they openly talk about Masonry and what happens in it. It's just there's some secrets that they're not supposed to talk about. So there's a lot of talk about Masonry that's not secretive. Point is, it's in the air. It's easy to find. I think Joseph, at some point, hears the story. I think he hears the story of cryptic Masonry, where Enoch has a pillar. The pillar says, there is a valuable treasure buried below. And I think Joseph, and it's scripture. It's scripture written by prophets. So there's a brass record that contains the history of creation. Same thing as in the Book of Mormon, right? Then I'm not sure if I'm gonna cheat and look at my notes.
That's not cheating.
You have destruction about to occur with Mormon, and so he buries this record, the record of his people, that contains brass records and gold, and the golden plates. Same thing with Enoch. Enoch buries the gold plate. He also has the brass record on the pillar. He buries that so that all this information will be preserved for a future generation, for someone who will rise up and restore this information down the road. And I think Joseph hears about Enoch's writing on this pillar that there's a valuable treasure in the bowels of the earth which contain the essence and end of Masonry, and was consecrated to the only true and living God. I think Joseph hears that, and he's like, man, why am I looking for candlesticks? There's something bigger here. That's what I think. Enoch, then when Enoch closes up this thing, he's allowed to visit this temple once a year. Remember, Joseph is required to visit his Temple Mount, his hill Cumorah, with the buried treasure, right? That's the gold plates in a vault, in a small vault, buried by an ancient prophet that during the time of destruction, he's required to visit that once a year also. So you have this interesting parallel. Enoch wanted to preserve these true principles, just like the Book of Mormon wanted to preserve true principles. Enoch engraves records on brass and gold, just like in the Book of Mormon, right? Both of them right before destruction. They both contain a history of creation, just like the brass plates. So does Enoch's record have a history of creation. And they're both bearing this so that it can be restored by somebody in the future. So I think that pops with Joseph Smith. That's the cryptic stuff. Then we have in Royal Arch Masonry, we have this high priest wearing a breastplate. And I'm going to find this an important quote here in Lucy Mack Smith's. Lucy Mack Smith writes about this. She says, quote, Joseph said, "Do not be uneasy, mother. All is right. See here, I have got a key." He calls it a key. "I knew not what he meant. I took the article of which he spoke into my hands, and upon examination found it consisted of 2 smooth, 3-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glasses were set in silver bows." This is Joseph Smith's translating device, but he calls it a key, same word that is used in the Royal Arch Masonic myth. The high priest puts on a breastplate, uses the key, and he translates the characters that were originally from a gold plate. So I think there's something going on there. I think this may be what inspired Joseph Smith to go on and allow Mormonism to come forth.
So you think there's a Masonic connection to the origin story of the golden plates? Is that?
I think so. Yeah, I think that at some point Joseph shifts from a common treasure seeker to a restorer of ancient scripture, buried scripture written by ancient prophets. And I think that story, and then the idea of the idea of how do we translate these, and what do we even wear while we're translating it, I think that also comes from Masonry.
See, that's really interesting. I'm going to take a little bit of a diversion or a tangent here because, it's always interesting. I know Mormons and anti-Mormons love to look at parallels. And so one of a theory that I find personally really stupid, but it applies to what we're talking about is the Solomon Spalding theory. Yeah. So the one piece of little bit of credit that I will give, and it doesn't deserve very much credit, but the one piece of little credit that I would give to the Solomon Spalding theory is the Spalding manuscript that we have found tells the story of a little stone box with a plate, and he moves and so I'm trying to remember what the main character is. The main character finds this, or it's in the introduction, I believe, finds this parchment and then translates it, and supposedly this document is supposed to be like the Book of Mormon. So the only resemblance between, and you should read, I will tell all my readers at home, or listeners at home, go read the actual manuscript found from Oberlin College, because it's laughably bad. It's just a horrible novel. The similarities are so surface, but the one part of the story that I will give a little bit of credit to is the story of finding this parchment, and it's, supposedly it takes in the time of Constantine, so the time period's way off from Lehi right off the bat, and it's so stereotypical. The Indians are so stereotypically Indian, like clearly they don't talk about Lamanites or anything like that, but the one part of the story is the finding of this parchment. And so I know a lot of and I would love to do a debunking the Spalding manuscript thing, and I'm not trying to do that, but the one piece that I will give it a little bit of credit is this story of the stone box and finding the parchment, very similar. And so it's interesting to me that you're talking about this ties to Masonry, because most, I try not to use anti-Mormons, but most critical Mormons, at least the ones who embrace the Spalding theory, would say, oh, this is just so similar. And that's the only piece of the theory that I will lend any credit to.
Sure.
And so can you comment on maybe the Spalding theory and why that's or maybe you like it, I don't know, but why that's
Well-
crap?
Well,
Because I think it's a crap theory, personally.
Rick, I have to confess, I have not looked at the Spalding theory. In fact, I learned, your summary, I'm like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So I don't know. The only thing I know is that when I first got into Mormon history, Mormons historians would say, don't even go down that rabbit hole. And I just trusted them. And so I can't tell you about that.
Yeah.
So
I guess the only reason I'm bringing this up is because, number one,
there's a parallel. There's something similar.
I feel like I can personally debunk that theory. And maybe I should take some time to do that sometime.
Yeah.
But there's a similarity. And so it's funny to hear that you're seeing these similarities with Masonry, whereas other critical Mormons would see the similarities with the Spalding manuscript theory.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I wonder how strong some of these parallels are. Whether the parallel to Masonry is as strong, because it's strange to me, because it seems like Cheryl's saying the same thing, that she sees Masonry even earlier, because it seems to me the common wisdom in Mormon history is that Joseph really didn't discover Masonry until the 1840s. And so it's interesting that you and Cheryl seem to be pushing it back much earlier.
Yeah.
So.
Right. And there is no smoking gun. There's no letter that Joseph is like, well, I just finished reading the Royal Arch Masonic ritual, and wow, so we only have parallels to go by. And so there is a problem with that, in that you can't create an airtight case. You can only say, look, here's some really fascinating parallels, and I throw that out, and people have to kind of go, yeah, maybe so, or I don't know. And it really comes down to that. I would suggest that the best thing to do is read, when I publish this, I'm going to try to detail it out a lot better than I'm doing now, and see what people think.
All right, and just the one last thing, because I'm sure I'm going to get comments from all the pro Solomon Spalding people. Just go read the manuscript, okay? And because everybody who promotes this theory has never read it. Read it.
Yeah.
They're like, well, somebody said, and there's this parallel, and these parallels are so surface and so stupid. And I'm going to be I usually try to be very neutral. This is one place where I will not be neutral. That is a crap theory, and it's horrible. And go read it from Oberlin College, and don't tell me there's this invented manuscript. Anyway, so sorry. There's my one rant.
That was a great rant.
So, I hope you enjoyed our conversation with historian Clair Barrus. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about a magic word that I'll bet you've used.
Abracadabra was a magic word, and it goes way, way back. And it probably had something to do with trying to conjure up the deity Abraxas. And you can find it, and it goes, you can find it in all sorts of books going way back.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents. And for just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview without any interruption. If you'd like a paperback version of our transcripts, go to Amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview. Also, if you'd like to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website, and I'll be able to send you a transcript as soon as they are completed, and click the subscribe button. You can also find our latest information on Facebook.com/GospelTangents, as well as we're on Twitter @GospelTangents. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. The link is at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, and you can subscribe there. Also, please give us a 5-star review. If you want to support all of the podcasts as part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, go to lyceum.fm, that's lyceum.fm, and do a search for Dialogue Podcast Network or Gospel Tangents, because, that's a pretty cool one too. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.